Every card game is built relatively the same when it comes to card design and the effects of those cards. With the Pokemon TCG, you want your deck to be strong, consistent, as well as disruptive, using specific cards to help establish your attackers and support Pokemon so you can start swinging for the win, while also making use of certain cards to disrupt your opponent and either slow them down or force them to re-establish a key part of their setup. These disruptive cards can be very powerful and at times force your opponent into an awkward situation, Boss's Orders, Counter Capture and Prime Capture being the go-to example, letting you pull up a certain Pokemon to knock out or something to slow down your opponent like a high retreat cost Pokemon. However, there are also plenty of other disruptive cards that are even more devastating than a simple Gust effect. A very good example is a card that recently rotated out of the game, being Path to the Peak, an incredibly notorious and very hated card that completely shut off abilities of all rulebox Pokemon, which for some decks completely ruins their game plan and brings the game to a crawl. Some decks can easily make use of these types of cards as tech options, but there are some decks whose entire purpose is to make the game a living hell for their opponent, playing a huge amount of these cards in order to stop, stun, stall, and eventually win the game by making your opponent unable to even play the game. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what we refer to as control decks. A control deck's main purpose is to take control over the game. Control decks are a staple in every single card game. A lot of players hate them since they rely purely on cheap strategies and exist solely to frustrate your opponent. I myself haven't played full control decks in the past, but I have played decks that use some of those highly powerful cards as a way to slow down your opponent. I'm personally very 50-50 when it comes to control decks. I think certain cards are fine when they only do simple effects that, while annoying, can be easily played around and don't automatically lose you the game. Airy, Misfortune Sisters, Hand Clippers to name a few. However, there is also the other side, and I think I can speak for many others when I say I cannot stand when cards lock you out of entire game mechanics. Cards that stop you from doing things that the game is based around you doing, or cards that stop you from just playing cards entirely. The biggest examples being Mawile from Lost Origin, Snorlax from Pokemon Go, and Burnett from Scarlet and Violet. Two Pokemon with very simple attacks and one with an incredibly annoying ability. Mawile for a single colourless energy prevents your opponent's active Pokemon from retreating, and it can also take 90 damage during the next turn. Snorlax does the exact same thing, but minus the damage increase, and it's on an ability instead of an attack. The second part of Mawile's attack literally doesn't matter, because you are only using this card for the first part of the attack. For some decks, this doesn't seem like a huge issue if you play switching cards or something like Jet Energy, but let's say you don't. Your opponent gusts up a support Pokemon that you can't use the attacks of because they require energy that you don't play. You have no switches, no Jet Energies, nothing that can move a different Pokemon into the active so that it can attack. Then congratulations, you just lost the game, because your opponent will keep attacking with Mawile or just keep passing their turn with Snorlax until you mill yourself out of cards. But don't worry, it gets even worse with Burnett. For one colourless energy, not only does it deal 30 damage, but during your opponent's next turn, they can't play any item cards. Oh, what's that? Your deck is made up of 80% item cards and you rely on them heavily as part of your strategy, and without them you just lose the game? Everlasting Darkness, Everlasting Darkness, Everlasting Darkness, Everlasting Darkness, Everlasting Dark. This type of card design is not healthy for the game. Being locked out of retreating isn't that bad since there are options to work around it, but being locked out of your ability to, play the game is awful card design. Next, they'll release a card that forces you to only control one type of Pokemon, or a card that stops you from attaching energy, or a card that stops you from playing supporters. Oh wait, that already exists and it's releasing next set. I understand why these types of cards need to exist in trading card games. It's to give you an ability to disrupt your opponent and also allow yourself to catch up with them if the game is feeling a bit one-sided. Your opponent is racing ahead of you in terms of card advantage and board presence, so these cards help to slow them down as you attempt to catch up. And for some decks, that is why they are used. Roxanne, for example, can disrupt your opponent's hand and leave them with very little for a follow-up, while giving you a fresh hand of 6. Eri can get rid of 2 item cards from your opponent's hand, and depending on what those item cards are, could potentially ruin your opponent's access to winning the game. Even certain Pokemon such as Fluttermane can prevent your opponent's active Pokemon from using their abilities, and against certain decks that can be game winning by itself. Control is necessary for TCGs, as it basically checks the top decks of the format, and if they can't find an out for those cards or a way to play around them, then it's already game over. It forces players to consider the matchup for events and encourages them to play certain cards in order to deal with control decks if they happen to face one. However, there are some cards that draw a very heavy line between control and just straight up unfair. Locking you out of playing cards or doing certain things altogether is not fun and does not promote a healthy game state. The Pokemon TCG has had worse cards in the past. Hexmaniac, Seismitoad EX, Archeops, and many more. However, in recent years, it seems that the Pokemon Company has died down on these super strong cards, and while the effects still exist on other cards, they are much harder to pull off and at times require additional steps or a very specific setup. Control is both bad and good for card games. Balancing their effects is key. Making a strong card to disrupt your opponent is not hard, but sometimes I think the Pokemon Company goes a bit overboard with some of their effects. Control decks and cards won't be going anywhere. Players will just need to consider the possibility of facing them at events, and thus build their deck to not only combat meta, but also take back the game once control has been established.